In the importing infrastructure lesson, we imported this API gateway custom domain name into CDK. When we were doing that, we mentioned that the domain name here and the certificate ID would probably change based on the account or environment, or maybe there would be things that you would put as a variable or as a context item. So we could move those over into a bit of context, and what we're going to do is we're going to go with the top level sort of settings approach, where it's a big blob of properties, and we're going to set those for the relevant accounts and environments. So in this case, we'll just do EU West 1 actually. I don't think we need to go as far as splitting out for Frankfurt. And we can set the domain name here, so let's pop that property into our cdk.json, give it some extra speech marks, and we can do the same with the certificate ID. So we could access those just as we have been doing previously with the app.node.tryGetContext method, but you might be thinking, well, this object could get quite big. How can I make sure that it's got the right properties and that they have the right types? Obviously in TypeScript, we could make an interface that described this shape or a type that described this shape, but there's no guarantee that at runtime we would actually get that at runtime, that we would have the correct data. So let's see how we could achieve that with a library called Zod. So I'm going to install Zod, lovely. And then let's pop over to our bin folder, and you can see we're setting up our API stack here. And then we'll do the Zod work just above here. Obviously you could put it in a separate file if you wanted to, and you likely would do to keep it a little bit cleaner. But for this example, we're just going to keep it in the same file so you can see it all in one place. With Zod, I usually start off by importing it with the alias Z for the whole package. And then we've got to create a parser, which is very similar to a validator, if you've ever made a validator in a different library. So let's say we're going to have our settings context validator, and then we're going to start off with a z.object. Now this isn't really going to be a Zod tutorial, but I just wanted to demo it as a bit of an example. So we could say here that we start off with our object, and inside the object we could do the whole thing if we wanted to, but I'm just going to validate these two keys, domain name and certificate ID. So both of those, are going to be strings, but we could use a richer type if we wanted to, say for the certificate ID. If we really wanted to validate that it's actually a UID, then we could go a little bit further. Where's the UID type? Let's have a look in string. There we go. See, I told you this wouldn't be a Zod tutorial. So there we go. We have certificate zstring.uid. And then we can create a type that will be the output of this parser. So we can do type settings equals z.infer, and then type of and the name of our parser here. So then settings as an object has a domain name, which is a string, and a certificate ID, which is a string. So we could start off by saying we're going to have to do this after the app's defined. Let's say the account level settings equals app.node.tryGetContext, and we're going to look for that top level settings key. And then we are going to look in here for the account ID. So we haven't got this in this project yet, but we can do that by using the CDK default account environment variable for the account ID and the CDK default region. And I'll tell you what, let's call that account rather than account ID. We can check by account first, and then we can say, okay, if we don't get this value here, then we're going to throw a new error and say that no settings were provided in the cdk.json for account, and pop the account in there. I've just realized that the types here are string or undefined, so let's validate those as well. I think in reality CDK would always provide those for us, so it's not really something we would have to manually validate, but we'll put the validation in there to appease TypeScript anyway. So we checked for our account level settings, which may or may not be present, and if they're not present, then we're going to throw an error, and then we're going to say the region level settings, and we're going to go one level further, so account level settings keyed by the region. Because if you remember, in our cdk.json under the settings object here, we had the account ID and then we had the region. And then if those are not set, then we will throw another error. And let's just copy that here and say account and region. Whoops, I didn't copy the whole thing. Let's take that over. So now at the end of this, we've definitely got something in this variable here, but it's typed as any. We don't know what shape it is in yet. So let's do the final step and let's actually parse that with Zod. So we can do settings equals the, what's the validator or parser called? Settings context validator, there we go. Dot parse, and then we have our region level settings. And then the type of settings as an object here has the correct values. It's got domain name and certificate ID. Now this parse method will throw an error if it fails, and you might want to do, say, safe parse, which gives you a result type effectively, either of a success true with your data or success false and an error. And that might be easier if you want to craft a custom error message. So let's do that. Let's adapt it to use safe parse. And then we can say if settings dot success, then we'll build our API stack. Else we will throw a new error, and we can say that settings in cdk.json for, let's pop these over from the other error message for the account and region, pop those into backticks, failed validation, and then we can pop in our error, which I think is going to be settings.error. There we go. Lovely. So either we succeed and we get the right shape, or we say, uh-oh, no, it didn't work, not going to have it. Let's set up our end while we're here with the account and region. We can pass those into CDK explicitly, which you may have to do if you're using context lookups, for example. And then we're just going to spread in settings.data, and we'll add two properties to our API stack props. So these are the default stack props type at the moment. So let's export a new interface for that. We'll extend stack props, and we'll add in domain name and certificate ID, like so. We'll change the type of our props object. We will pop those values, into the two resources that are using them. So props.certificate ID, and this is going to be props.domain name. And let's pop back to the bin file in the getting started.ts in the bin folder. Make sure that's all still fine. Yeah, and that's okay. TypeScript's happy with that. And there we go. Then we've got full validation for our CDK settings. So let's see what happens if we don't have the right values. I'm just going to change the account ID that's in the cdk.json to have an underscore at the end. And let's try a synth. And there we go. Cannot read properties undefined, reading that value. Have I got this key wrong? Oh, yeah, sorry, I've put setting, not settings. Let's give that another try. That's better. So we see no settings are provided in CDK.json for the account and the account number. So let's get that bit right, and then let's pop ourselves over to Frankfurt by setting the AWS region. And when we set the AWS region here, that will influence CDK, and it will change the value we get in our CDK default region environment variable. So let's run another synth. And it will say, no settings provided CDK.json for our account ID and Frankfurt, which is great. Happy with that. Let's unset the AWS region so we go back to what's in my profile, which is Ireland or US1. And then let's make a bit of a mess of these properties. So let's say I put domain-name and certificate-ID rather than the camel-cased versions. And we can run another synth. And there we go. Settings in cdk.json for account and region, failed validation, and then we get the Zod error message. And you could go the extra mile and turn this Zod error message into something that's a bit prettier or a bit more user-friendly. I'm sure if you've been programming for any amount of time, you're used to reading really obscure error messages, so you'd be able to work it out that these parts are missing. Or you could pop into your CDK.json and compare it to other ones that are working and see what you've gotten wrong. But if we change those back, we should now get a successful synth. And there we go. And so we looked at how we could use Zod, a library for runtime type safety, to validate the shape of our context data. And obviously you can use Zod for all sorts. You could use it for the input to a Lambda function, this kind of use case, really anything where you want that runtime type safety. When we made our Zod parser here, we used things like the z.object and z.string for different types that we wanted to put together to form some kind of shape. And we even went a bit further and we specified the type that our string had to be, or more accurately, I should say, the format of the data that the string would be in. We then used that parser to create a type for our props by using z.infer. And then we went through the same setup we've done previously for when we had to manually specify an account and region. So we use the CDK default account and CDK default region environment variables, which are provided by CDK based on the profile of the thing calling CDK. We added a quick bit of validation in to make sure that the types change from string or undefined just to string, make sure they're set. And then we went level by level as we go through our context object, checking that we've got settings for the account, settings for the region, and then that the final settings object was in the correct shape. And at each level, we spat out a descriptive error message if something was wrong.